Whose job is it to make money in an organization? Well, it's everybody's job. So what does that mean? How do you help to drive the economic engine of an organization in your everyday role? You sit at your desk and say to yourself, how do I make money? No, you think about the underlying drivers. So what I like to remind people is there's only one reason why the bottom line is at the bottom, and that's because everything else is above it. It's an outcome. The survival of an organization is not a factor of its age. It's a factor of its adaptive capacity. Now, that in turn is driven by our ability to learn. And I think as leaders, we need to demonstrate as role models that we're all on a learning journey.
I've so been looking forward to this. So I read your book as well as watched a number of podcasts, just fascinating. Your most recent book, Leadership, The Inside Story, Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. There is so much to dig into there. And I thought it'd be awesome to start with a little bit of your background, how you were raised in South Africa and how it formed your world views for our listeners. So that's a great setup for as we get into these topics in your book.
Sure. As you mentioned, born and raised in South Africa in a smallish town called East London on the coastline, and went to an all-boys school there. And looking back on that whole experience now, a number of insights have occurred to me. The first is that we're all a product of our background and upbringing to a certain extent. And I was raised there during the period of time when apartheid, that strict separation of the races, was being applied pretty brutally. Couldn't go to the same schools, received the same treatment from the same hospitals, couldn't marry across the color bar. And it was very divisive, very cruel, very oppressive. But here's the interesting thing. Let's say as a 5-year-old, growing up in this environment, I knew no other frame of reference. This is all I knew. This is, in my reckoning at that tender age, my belief that this is the way the world worked. Kind of a form of mental imprinting. And we realize that we're all subject to this as well. And we have to learn our way out of it. And I think Alvin Toffler's formulation about learning our way to success in life, where he says the task is to learn, unlearn, and relearn, is doubly applicable here. And my unlearning process from this, escaping, if you like, from this mental imprinting, was a journey with a number of steps. It was not like flicking a switch and coming to a different point of view. There were a number of steps in my life. Going to college, eventually going to Oxford, as you mentioned, looking at South Africa from the outside in, getting a new perspective, that level of objectivity, forming a little study group of South Africans in Oxford to talk about the issues there and to think about the future, and coming to a conclusion that helped me escape from the prison of that imprinting. And that conclusion was that this policy of apartheid was wrong, unjust, and cruel, and needed to be changed, and that I would dedicate myself in the best way I could on my return to South Africa to be a part of that change. In a small way, it may be, but I'm mindful always of that little idiom that says, no individual raindrop ever blames itself for the flood. But unless we have lots of raindrops, there's no flood and no pressure. But I eventually left South Africa after practicing law there for 5 years because the situation seemed to be pretty dismal. The outlook seemed to be set for violence. I left and had an international business career, eventually posted to the United States by Unilever, and watched the whole transformation by Nelson Mandela from my home in Connecticut with a sense of awe and admiration, and realized what the absolute heights of effective moral leadership looks like when you study the life and the deeds of Nelson Mandela. Huge learning situation for me.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me with all of that is how Nelson Mandela navigated the transition of power. You talk about the three domains of leadership, leading self, interpersonal, i.e., bringing out the best in others, and then strategic leadership. Can you kind of walk through at a high level using your framework how he navigated the transfer of power without having it be a violent transfer?
Certainly. Well, first you've got to say that the situation looked hopeless, if not impossible. A peaceful transfer of power was kind of like a pipe dream. And Mandela, who'd been imprisoned, and he was in prison for 27 years and subject to huge indignities and unjust actions and situations close to abuse, he managed to lead this transformation. Now, what I like to do is to look at this leadership, this majestic leadership example, through the prism of this framework that helps me think productively and intentionally about what leadership actually is, what it consists of, what its elements are. And for me, there are these three interlocking domains in a Venn diagram. I almost said a Zen diagram, but that's almost too close for the truth. And the three domains consist of, first of all, personal leadership. That's leadership of self. Deep self-awareness, being grounded in a clear set of values that guide our actions and inspire others. It's the starting point for effective leadership. I call that permission to lead, that level of authenticity that we need to have in place. Second domain of leadership is strategic leadership, to ensure that the organization that you're leading has a clear sense of direction, a winning way, and a shared set of priorities for success. That's not easy to pull off in and of itself, but it's not an independent activity. It's dependent on how effective we are as personal leaders. And the third domain of leadership is interpersonal leadership, the ability to bring out the best in others. Now, that one is actually quite interesting to me. I think we're all aware of the fact that leaders are able to bring out the best in others. And, as Peter Drucker said, the purpose of an organization is to get ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Now, that's true, but as you know from your rich experience, it's not just the leader at the top. It's a form of distributed leadership, that everybody in the organization, not just the leader at the top, is able to bring out the best in others. And you think of a successful sports team, that's always the case. It's not just a team of stars, it's a star team where each individual player doesn't just play his or her own game, but helps everybody else succeed and lifts everybody else up. Now, that's the form of leadership that we have to establish as a leader. That's the kind of culture and set of behaviors that we have to instill. Those are the three domains. And when I look at Mandela and view his example through those three domains, the most striking thing is his leadership and his mastery of self. He was imprisoned for 27 years on an island called Robben Island. Hard labor every day, severe indignities every day. And he didn't know, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He didn't know it was going to be only for 27 years, which is how it emerged after the pressure was exerted to free him and negotiate with the Afrikaners for some kind of a transition. But he used that time to reflect, and he developed an ideal, a vision for the peaceful transfer of power. Now, that seemed impossible, but he realized that there were certain galvanizing factors that would lead him there. And the very first thing was mastery of self, to eliminate the sense of grievance, resentment, anger, hostility that he felt inside him, being subjected every day to indignities for 27 years. You have to really learn to forgive every day. We think of forgiveness as a forgiveness of an insult or an unfair action by somebody else, a singular thing. This was daily. So that kind of mastery over self was, I think, the most important thing. But he realized that if he wanted everybody in South Africa to join together on a mission, on a journey of a peaceful transfer of power based on a democratic set of ideals, he first had to change himself and be the prime example of this. So he learned Afrikaans, which was not his native language. That was the language of the Afrikaners, the oppressors, if you like. Spoke to them their language, including the jailers. And when he was released to negotiate, he negotiated in Afrikaans, showing people that he respected who they were, what their history was, and what was important to them culturally. And he had this motto that when you speak to somebody in his language, if you speak to somebody in a language that he understands, you speak to his head. When you speak to him in his language, you speak to his heart. So he learned their language for that reason. So this was the mastery of self. And then I think the negotiations took this vein where he did it with this demonstration of the highest ideal of all. Let's collectively avoid the violence and bloodshed that would destroy this country and lead it to a higher place. And let's be the role models that gets the whole country there. Now, he did something profoundly important that I think in the business world we need to think about as well, is you need to provide pathways for people to go through a journey like this, to align them behind an idea like this. You can't just say to the entire population of 60 million people, I want you all to develop the concept of a rainbow nation and forgive past sins and reconcile together as one nation. Please, I'm asking you to do that. Well, you might as well just mail it in. Established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in combination with Desmond Tutu, who was the Archbishop of Cape Town at the time. And that commission was a process that enabled people who had administered this cruelty, these injustices, to come before the commission, give them an opportunity to admit their wrongdoing and show remorse and ask for forgiveness. If they did that, they would be forgiven. If they denied it, they would be put on trial as usual, and if found guilty, they would be punished. Now, that enabled the entire nation to go through the process collectively of understanding that we need to cross this bridge to arrive at reconciliation, which in many ways is an act of grace and generosity. But the alternative of violence was obviously unacceptable and nihilistic. It would lead nowhere. Now, that's an enormous thing to pull off, but he did. Now, strategic leadership, which is giving a clear sense of direction and priorities, reminds us that no leader is perfect. And while he did great things in terms of improving healthcare, housing, education, and so on, with meager budgetary availability, there were gaps for the time he left office. So if I were to mark him, and I've got to say this in all humility, to mark somebody like that with a scorecard, but we learn, that's the way we learn, is I would give him an A++ on personal leadership, something that, Gandhi demonstrated, Martin Luther King demonstrated, but there are very few examples in the world of this kind of leadership and mastery over self. I would give him a B+ on strategic leadership simply because the gaps were not fully closed, and perhaps you can't do that in a short period of time, fine. And on interpersonal leadership, I would also give him an A++. Now, I like this structure, and I created it because we need to think about the journey of improvement. We learn our way to success. Nobody is perfect. We all start from a baseline where we need to grow and learn as we confront new challenges in life. And I think if we just think in too general a way, we can't really do this effectively. So break it down into these three components that work for me, which enables us to say as leaders, how am I doing on personal leadership? How am I doing on strategic leadership? How am I doing on interpersonal leadership? And the other thing is we all need feedback. And you can't just walk around and say to people, how am I doing? Like Ed Koch used to do in New York City, the mayor used to walk around the streets here and say, hi, everybody, how am I doing? Now, it's a big question. Oh, you're fine, or, terrible, or whatever it is. That's not a useful way to get feedback. It's much more constructive to be able to say, how am I doing on personal? How am I doing on strategic? How am I doing on interpersonal leadership? Because I need to learn and grow. So that's why I find that useful, and it's been a useful construct for me as well to look at leadership models or others that have been, demonstrative of what it takes to lead effectively, and look at that through that kind of prism.
Yeah. Yeah. When I look at all three, it's kind of a circular argument as to which one is most important of the three. And it's super contextual. And I think about the strategic piece with Nelson Mandela. Like, we can't do any of that other stuff unless I get this done. So I'm giving him an A+ on getting that first giant hurdle crossed, and then maybe a B or a B- on thinking holistically about the second phase of that strategic leadership, going in. But pretty incredible. And the thing I love about this, and what I love about reading your book, you talk about it's super important to make anything that's complex or that take basically complexity and make it simple. That should be our job as leaders. And of course, there's a lot of leaders out there that make complexity impossible. That seems to be their superpower. But we want to go the other way. And I've always thought about it. The most elegant solution is simplicity on the other side of complexity. In other words, you can't cookie cutter lace the end. You have to just really dig in and understand it to get there and do the work to get there. And it's fun and it's super rewarding. What you've done here, and this was, we talked about it a little bit before we started recording. To me, this is how it's landing on me. You've simplified the complexity of the language of leadership and how to think about it. And I believe if we can get it to more leaders, you make it more available to a much larger set of leaders to where they'll actually understand it because of your language and simple but wildly powerful frameworks over so many other leaders out there, laying out their frameworks. How does that land on you? Was that intentional, that you really wanted to simplify it and organize it in a powerful way? What was your thinking there?
Well, there are two integrated principles here. One is to have a clear structure for thinking purposefully about what it is you'd like to excel at. First, define what it is, its foundations, its key elements, and then it gives you the basis from which you can hope to learn and grow. The other element, which I think always comes into play and is in many ways an overriding requirement for effective leadership, is the ability to simplify. And the world is becoming more and more complicated. Full of disruptions, the latest being AI, for example. And we need to have a working knowledge of this if you want to run an organization today. You can't be a deep expert in it, but you really have to understand what it can do for you by way of creating value, which is what you talk about all the time. That's the job of a leader, to create superior value that didn't exist before. Now, what do we do about AI as a way of, how do we simplify? How do we get a grip of that organizationally? Well, the first thing for me in any event, and I'd love to have your thoughts on it, as I deal with this in a number of seminars with people in different organizations facing different challenges and saying, well, AI is a giant thing. I need to get a grip on this and understand what it can do for us. Now, the first thing I like to say is that artificial intelligence is a delivery mechanism to deliver value of some kind. So first decide the value that you wanted to create for you and then work backwards from there. It's an instrument. That's what it's not. It's not like a mechanical mouse. It'll just do it for you without you thinking about it. Now, for example, I've done a number of workshops with physicians in the medical field in different specialties in the New York Presbyterian healthcare system. And in the last 5-day program that we had, we spent a good deal of time examining this issue of artificial intelligence. Now, the first thing I did to try and simplify, without oversimplifying, is draw a horizontal line and say, well, there are two ways that it can create value. The denominator reduces cost and creates a better operating system. And the numerator helps to create greater value for the patients you seek to serve. Let's think about it that way. Now, if you look at the denominator, that's mainly the responsibility of the system that you work in. Electronic medical records, for example, that are universal throughout the US and perhaps one day globally. You have to constantly fill out 20 pages of information each time you see a doctor because it's all there. Now, that the system has to do for you. Now, let's go to the numerator. And we talked about that and came to the conclusion that there are a couple of things that you can do with AI that would make a colossal difference to your effectiveness as a physician. First is the question, in your specialty, do you come across rare diseases or conditions that you've never seen before? That you're baffled, that you'd like to solve the problem, but you've never seen this before? Well, AI has. Somewhere in the world, somebody has seen that and developed a therapy, and you can find out how well it worked. How would that help if you could do that? Well, that would be tremendous. The second is there are clinical trials happening all over the world. In Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Africa, Latin America, USA, etc., all over the world. And those are of tremendous interest to you. There are phases in clinical trials, phase 1, 2, 3, but you can track what's happening. Now, if you ask a team of people to summarize all these clinical trials that are happening in your specialty, how long would it take and what kind of team would you need? They said, it's impossible. Well, AI can do that. So let's start with those are the problems we seek to solve. Now, how can we use this as a delivery mechanism to get us there? Now, I'd love to have your perspective on it, but there's a huge talent shortage here on the expertise. There are very few people who really know. This thing is galloping ahead so fast that it's bewildering. There are very few people, and the talent is being scooped up by the big tech companies and the smaller enterprises who are looking. And I've just worked with an organization last week. Yes, we'd like the expertise, but where do we find it? Do we outbid the big tech companies to find it, etc.? Well, there's a whole learning process involved in that. And there's a kind of a thing of a leader providing strategic leadership, but doing it in a way that simplifies the task, the job to be done, helps people think constructively, because complexity paralyzes an organization and simplicity empowers it.
Yeah, 100%. So I always like to step all the way back and say, okay, what are we really trying to do? And I look at a CEO, and this is my belief. Philosophically, each CEO's job is to continually and responsibly increase the value of their organization. So we create some product or service or a combination of things that we hope is the best value alternative for our customers. And we want to grow that over time. And there's lots that we look at around that. And I love the way you talk about thinking about an organization the same way you would think about evolutionary biology. We need to constantly change and keep up with these external factors that are going on so we can survive. And lots of examples of companies that sat on their hands and didn't pay attention and went under, even after 100 plus years, some of them. So if that's the goal, and the entire team is engaged in creating this value, and when you look at the value in an organization, to me, Willie, it's measured by it could be the stock price if it's private. It's EBITDA multiples typically that go on. for their market. But when I look at emotional energy value in a company, I think it's the X factor for leaders. And I spent a lot of time on that in my different businesses over time. And I got multiples, in some cases, almost 3 times what our competitors were getting when I exited because of that. And then on the spiritual side, in the context of an organization, it's all about the connectedness piece. So what are we doing? Team members connected with themselves, which, is a big part of what you talk about, with leadership. But I would go out of my way to do that with every single team member so they understood themselves, better understand how to work with others, all of it. So so here's all the things that we have. We need to create this value. Now, AI is a tool. AI to me is a marketing slogan, kind of like the cloud. There is no cloud storing our stuff. There's no self-aware being here doing this. It's basically a really unique, powerful algorithm that gets better and better. So can we use that tool to continually create more value and responsibly and continually increase the value of the business? My challenge with AI, in some ways, I know the algorithms are getting a lot better, and I don't know the pace at which they're getting better, but I know they are. Is that some of the early AI, discoveries around pulling data in to solve problems may have been the best we'll ever have, because now we're compiling data from things that have been made up by AI plus what's real. So my challenge with it is, how do you know it's good data that it's pulling from? So it's super important to make sure the guardrails are correct, so we're getting the right information. But for me, it's just a tool, and it can save a tremendous amount of time, so we can create even more value going forward. So that was a giant answer to your question, but it has to be contextualized, and it has to be really intentional about how we're using it to create value, and what will that value be, and how would you actually measure it? So I'll stop there. How does that land on you?
No, very good. That's a good summation. I think our ideas converge. The way I try to simplify for people who have a responsibility to generate value is pose a number of kind of questions or challenges that help to clarify their mission in an organization. Now, you started off by mentioning evolutionary science. And the way I think about evolutionary science and its effect on performance in human organizations is that sometimes we have freedom of choice. Other times we're bound by laws. And if we disobey the laws, we can't expect to succeed. And one of those, for example, is gravity. I don't have a choice to say, if I throw a ball up in the air, I prefer it to stay up there. It'll come down. It's a law. And evolutionary science is like that too. And it tells us something pretty important that's absolutely incontrovertibly true. And that is, the only means of survival in the long term is the organizational capability to adapt successfully over time to the changing external conditions. Now, what Darwin taught us is that the external environment won't adapt to us. We have to adapt to the external environment. Now, when I lay that out in my own mind and convey it to a team of people, they say, well, now let's go from there. Let's work with that law, that truth, and think about what we should do. And the first realization is that success occurs outside the boundaries of our organization, not inside. That's where we'd create value. Now, we have to generate that value by mobilizing our resources, motivations of our people internally. But we need to be a sense and respond organization. Sensing comes first, that external environment, and then how do we respond in a way that outperforms our competitors and lifts up the performance of everybody as the way you've described it. So that's the first kind of level of simplification. Then I think about, profitability. Whose job is it to make money in an organization? Well, it's everybody's job. So what does that mean? How do you help to drive the economic engine of an organization in your everyday role? You sit at your desk and say to yourself, how do I make money? No, you think about the underlying drivers. So what I like to remind people is there's only one reason why the bottom line is at the bottom, and that's because everything else is above it. It's an outcome. You can't manage the bottom line. So understanding the drivers of the bottom line is the critical thing. Now let's talk about those. And then those will contribute to a better bottom line. The critical driver for me is to create superior value for customers. So we always start on the outside and we're competing for customers. If you think about the basic purpose of the business, it's to generate and retain customers. If we do that efficiently, we make a lot of money. If we lose customers or if we fail to gain them, we'll fail. So there's a kind of a formula for me that says we need to have a winning way, I call a winning proposition, supported by a set of key priorities. And how does that occur? Well, it occurs first of all by creating superior value for customers. So that's where we go outside. Now we come in and say, if I do that very well, that will help me generate superior profitability for the enterprise, provided we do that efficiently, but it starts outside and then comes inside. So those are the kinds of, guidelines I like to offer people in terms of simplicity. And the other, which I write about in the book, is about prioritizing. I mean, the core of any effective strategy is the right set of priorities, which are shared by everybody and is supported by their passions and their commitment, not their compliance, their commitment. And the question is, how many priorities should there be? I mean, I'm sure you've come across organizations where we want to do these 10 things. We want to do these 15 things.
Oh, well, I have stories. Yes.
It's a long way.
Yeah.
And I write a whole chapter on this, of this psychology professor at Missouri State University, Nelson Mandela, who did this tremendous piece of research, well validated. And what he explored was what he called working memory, the amount of items we can retain in our minds and function effectively. And his answer was, and it's pretty conclusive, 3, maximum 4. So the old kind of, received wisdom that we need to have no more than 5. 5 is the wrong number. It's too many. And the decline in effectiveness is not linear. It's exponential. So if you've got 5, the chances are people can't remember all 5. I can't pull it together. And there's an acid test. If you ask people to develop 5 priorities, no more than 5, if that's your guideline, they'll sit down and talk about it, and they get to 3 or 4 and begin to ask questions like, well, what more is there? Now, that for me is a pathetic question. The right question is what's truly important, right? And the other test is if they've got 5 and they're leading their team and saying, these are the 5 things that are most important, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they have to look at a list to remind themselves, they've lost the plot. So that's the other discipline. Philosophy has taught me a lot about thinking about these things clearly as I can. We all need guidance, right? And philosophy is a big subject that for me tells us as human beings what's true, what's important, and what's right. So in decision making, it's always what's true is complicated because it's a lot of different ways to interpret truth. And I think it was Nietzsche, the philosopher, who said there's no data, there's only interpretation. And then from all of that, what's really important? And then we wrestle with what's right, what's the right thing to do. And the real wrestling is between right and right. 2 things, both right, but which is the best? What's the best thing to do? Then we loop back to what's important. And we find that in our priorities.
Yeah, and Willie, when I work with teams on strategy, and I've actually worked with hundreds of companies and lots, thousands of leaders, Strategy is an interesting word. A
Yes.
lot of folks, it's kind of complicated. It's only for the best leaders, the best thinkers. What's the framework? Am I doing the thing right? So, in my effort to try to simplify that, I've landed on strategy is nothing more than approaches to increasing the value of the business. And I get to work with companies from startup to 60 billion plus market cap. And every single time, even in the large ones, I find they'll send me their strategy decks, these PowerPoints, and there could be over 100 initiatives in it. But when you distill it all out, there's usually not more than 4 areas that create well over 80% of the value for the
Yes.
entire organization. So I'll take the 100 plus initiatives and I'll categorize them. And usually about 20 of them are true initiatives that will fall into one of those categories, i.e., do this and it will increase materially the value of the business. All of the rest of them, I put them in a category called please do your job. Like it's like continuous improvement, that kind of stuff. So what do you think of that approaches to increasing the value of business? Because 100% of the time leaders go, oh my gosh, now I understand instead of am I doing the thing right? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we can also take it one step further, as I think you do, which is to define what that means. How do I generate value? What do I do on Monday morning to generate value in my job? And what I think we've been taught about strategy, and it comes from the military. It's not a civilian concept. It was born in the military. The word strategy comes from a Greek word, strategia, which is a compound of 2 words, to lead the army. It's a military concept in its origins. It didn't really exist in the corporate world until, the 1970s. People used the term long-term planning in General Motors, etc. That was the prevailing thing led by Peter Drucker at the time. And but the military definition of strategy, mainly from von Clausewitz, who I think was the thought leader here, honed from hundreds, maybe even thousands of years of battles and the learning that came out of that. And that's a high-stakes game, the military fighting battles, because it's existential. You can lose your life. You can lose the freedom of your country. So they've honed this on the basis of those hard lessons of what strategy is really about. And there's a definition from von Clausewitz that I like to use. And it runs like this, and I'm speaking from memory, but it says the talent of the strategist is to identify the decisive point and then concentrate everything on it, withdrawing forces from lesser fronts and ignoring lesser objectives. It's all about focus. It's all about, the decisive point for me is and I think this is a translation from the German. And I think if you go into the text, read his book on war, 1832, what he's getting at there is the difference between winning and losing. That's the decisive point. So I derive from that what I call the winning proposition. So I'm with you in terms of generating value. Identifying the decisive point is a hard job because it's the quality of your intelligence system, understanding the external environment in order to be able to define that winning way, what I call the winning proposition. I think strategy has got 3 key deliverables. It answers 3 questions based on our intelligence system that informs those questions. First is, where will we compete? Where will we not compete? You can't do everything. Second question is, how will we win? By creating greater value for our customers than the competing alternatives and translating that into superior economic value. And the third will what would be our key priorities for success. So just those 3 questions are extremely hard to answer, but this is a pretty high-stakes set of decisions. That's your choice-making. And I think what von Clausewitz introduced to our thinking is there's only one reason you need to have a strategy in the first place, and that's because of the reality of limited resources. So that forces you to make choices about where will we compete How will we win? What will be our key priorities for success? It's all about making the right choices. So everything that precedes those three questions is about, what I call doing an effective situation analysis to inform the choices. And everything we do after that is about implementation and alignment behind those. So that's the way I think about it in kind of stark, simple ways. But you're right. When you add it all together, it's about generating superior value. That's the bottom.
And I think a lot of folks, so there's the strategy, ideas, everybody can come up with them. Executing on it is the thing. So another brilliant piece of wisdom and how it landed on me from your book and how I'm going to use it to explain it more simply to so many leaders out there as I do my work, diversity of thought organized into unity of action. Mm-hmm. And I've added to it unity of value creating action, because there's a lot out there on you need to have a bias for action. Well, if it's not creating value, that doesn't really matter. So I've even changed that to I want to have a bias for value creation, not just doing something. Activity is not the goal, creating value is. But when you take strategy, we're making decisions about what are the next things that we're going to do, the right number of them, the resources around it, all of it, more and more value at a lowering relative cost over time, continue, improve experience for customers. I love the way you say that, diversity of thought organized into unity of action. So strategy, we've got all these different ideas coming in. We need to distill it down into this is what we're going to do. That's making it really easy for people to understand that we're having a hard time with it before. I mean, this diversity of thought into unified action. Talk about that a little bit. Then I want to get into when we get it right and when we get it wrong, because getting it wrong can really set people up unintentionally for failure.
Well, it starts with this notion for me in doing what I call a situation analysis, which is exploring the external environment, the needs of customers, the actions of competitors, the trends in the industry like artificial intelligence and other things, and our own realities, our own performance metrics, our own strengths and weaknesses. It starts there and being able to distill it down to an integrated set of critical insights that help us to frame the challenge that confronts us and develop our strategic choices. Now, how do you get the best ideas? If you're really looking at the external environment, the worst thing you can do is to say, well, that's all about marketing. We'll just get the marketing people to do it or the salespeople to do it because they're the experts in it. The research is pretty clear that diversity of thought produces much better outcomes than functional experts thinking alone. They get to the point of just reinforcing each other's ideas, finishing each other's sentences eventually, and they don't challenge their underlying assumptions. They just live with them as just, this is received wisdom. So this issue of, assumptions drive decisions. So this issue of having diversity of thought as you explore these issues involves challenging underlying assumptions that open up new ways of thinking. Now, ultimately, a decision needs to be made. You've got all this diversity of thought that helps to enrich the quality of our insights and the conclusions that we draw. But now you have to switch gear. I mean, you can't just go on playing with this and saying, well, I want better and better information. You're only going to have about 75% of what you'd ideally like to know anyway. And what you paid for is the judgment you exercise in the remaining 25%. Rough and ready number. Different, of course, in rocket science and neurosurgery, but it's never 100%. So now you need to make a decision. And now you go from divergent to convergent. And that's a switch of gear. So culturally, how do you get the organization to understand that kind of moment of switching gear where we get aligned behind the same thing, unity of action behind a great idea of value creation? Now, I was working with a colleague some years ago who was actually a CEO. I was bringing him into the classroom to talk about running a business. And he gave me a great way to think about this. And he said, being on board is the way we behave after a decision has been taken. I just love that. It's a kind of another simple way of saying to people, okay, now we've got to get on board. here's the decision, as Colin Powell said about making great decisions. You are not making great decisions if you don't end up pissing off some people at least. Not everybody's going to like your decision. Well, they won't by definition because you've had diversity of thought. But what you can do is you can thank these people for their diverse ideas because you can tell them that they have enhanced the quality of the decision. And that's true. And that's a way of getting people to realize that they're creating value in the decision-making process as well.
Okay. And how do you, what's your recommendation for overcoming confirmation bias when it completely limits your ability to create value? I always like to create a culture where somebody can just be, passionately talking about this is the only way we're going to do this. And at the same time, if somebody says this is a way that would be 20% better, they'll shift on a dime because it's all about creating value. It's not about my idea has to win. So confirmation bias is super interesting to me. What's your advice around that?
Well, as we make these big decisions as leaders and get, collective intelligence involved in making great decisions by engaging people, involving them, participation is magical in terms of motivating people. We have to make pretty big decisions, that will shape our destiny. Now, there's a difficulty. We approach all of this with an assumption of objectivity. It's a false assumption. Nobody on earth is capable of totally objective thinking. We're not wired that way. We all have impulses. We all have desires that influence our thinking. And so I lay out in the book, as you mentioned, the 4 major biases that I've observed. And the one that you're referring to, confirmation bias, is one of them. Before I get to it, though, here's an interesting thing. I think one of the biggest pervasive biases of all is the belief that we tend to harbor that everybody else is biased except us. And that's the way political parties work as well. Oh, they're biased, but not us. Now, we're all biased. What it takes is awareness. And without awareness, these biases can be hidden, subconscious, can derail our thinking. The confirmation bias, which we all share to some degree or another, is the tendency to approach an issue with a preconceived idea of what's true, and then selectively look for evidence to confirm what we already believe, and to reject any disconfirming evidence. And, unless we're aware of our tendency to do that, it can derail our thinking. We don't approach problems with a completely clean slate. We have a worldview as adults. We've had experiences. We've bumped into things. We've had failures. We've had successes. And these begin to form a point of view. And this point of view tends to be the starting point, the entry point for addressing challenges that we're confronting. So there's only one antidote, and that is awareness. And so we can monitor our own thinking, discuss it with our teams, and have the ability to call each other out and keep each other honest in terms of working from truth, working from objective reality, and not just our individual preferences. So decision-making is hard. In a complex world, it's even harder. In a fast-changing world, we've always also got the status quo bias working. That's where we find comfort and control. And when we ask people to change to doing something different than they've done before, it's frightening, and it's, you're pulling up by the roots what they find comfortable, and they feel a loss of control. So we have to address that as well. I tell the story in the book of Kodak and the status quo bias. Kodak, wonderful company, had 90% of the film market and 85% of the camera market. In 1996, it was the 5th most valuable brand in the world. And it went insolvent after 132 years of existence. At its height, everybody thought it was invincible, but it went broke. And it went broke because it was overtaken by digital photography. Now, the devastating thing about this story is that it was Kodak who invented digital photography, an engineer called Mike Sasson. And he was very excited. He presented it to the leadership team. And of course, they realized that this would cannibalize their existing business, and that was a source of resistance. And he said, well, this is the future. If we don't adopt it, then somebody else will. And they said, well, no, not if you don't tell them, Mike. Now, he gave an interview to the New York Times. I'm able to quote this guy. That's what he said, the New York Times. At the end of the day, at the meeting, they said, Mike, that's a cute idea, but don't tell anybody. He didn't tell anybody, and they went broke, defeated by their own technology. Now, that's the power of the status quo bias. Let's cling to what we have. It's going to be fine next month. It's going to be fine in 3 months, probably be fine in about a year, too. Let's just continue doing what we're doing now. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't tell anybody about this fancy new thing. Well, it's a sad story. But it is a story that I use to illustrate the power of the status quo bias. And this thing we cling to, the reality we have now. Now, in a changing world, it can't work. We have to think again back to what Charles Darwin reminded us of, the ability to adapt.
You talk about the importance of learning, and I completely agree that curiosity is the superpower of learning. What about the importance, as I listen to you, the importance of unlearning? It's in some ways, I feel like that may be more important depending on, what the situation calls for.
It's the hardest of the things that we are confronted with in terms of learning. I think Alvin Toffler did a brilliant thing when he broke it down and disaggregated it and said, no, it's not just about learning. If you can't successfully unlearn old habits that are no longer fit for purpose in an organization, and then relearn, you can't adapt. And I often ask people at the beginning of a workshop, say, well, we need to learn our way to success. Adaptation in nature is a blind process of generating variations that happen through, the variations in your genetic makeup. And if you're lucky, they're favorable variations, and they help you to succeed and to survive. If you're unlucky, they're unfavorable variations, but in nature, it's a blind process. 99% of the species that have ever existed are now extinct. Now, in human organizations, we have the ability to learn, to think and to learn. So I think we've got a higher shot at successful adaptation. But the record is not very good. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies and their survival rates, it's about half of a human life. Now, that's not very good. I mean, some companies have lasted a very long time, others a very short time, and we're talking about an average. But the average life expectation of a corporation is pretty poor. It's not good. Now, I think what we can tell ourselves when we think about evolutionary science is that the adaptive capacity or the survival of an organization is not a factor of its age. It's a factor of its adaptive capacity. Now, that in turn is driven by our ability to learn. And I think as leaders, we need to demonstrate as role models that we're all on a learning journey and instill the habits and the processes and practices in an organization to help instill collective learning in this kind of way that helps an organization to adapt. And I provide a methodology for doing that called strategic learning, which is in one of the chapters of the book. Because again, I think we need to have tools to do this as opposed to just an injunction, an exhortation to people. We've got to keep learning. Well, I always say, well, when you sit at your desk on Monday morning, ask yourself, what am I going to do now? Well, give people the tools to do jobs like that. And but here's the interesting thing, if I may just mention this. There was an impulse to write this new book. Leadership, the inside story. Time-tested prescriptions for those who seek to lead. There was an impulse to do that. I've been doing a lot of teaching and consulting on strategy. And just like you, as a leader of organizations, constantly honing the strategy of an enterprise. I developed these tools to do a strategy. There's a workbook associated with it, lead organizations through it. And I began to observe something. Some organizations do it very, very well and succeed at it. Other organizations do it in an indifferent kind of way and really don't succeed at it. And the question was framed for me in a very stark way at a start of a seminar a few years ago, when I said to people, well, let's first determine, what we are striving to do here. And this woman got out of her seat, and she was a large, imposing person. And she said, I'm here to find out whether this methodology that you're offering, strategic learning, does it work? And I thought about it, a bit taken aback by the question. It was a fairly aggressive question that she asked. It was a bit more like an accusation.
Right.
I collected my thoughts and I said, well, to be honest with you, it works if you make it work. Now, there's no silver bullet. There's no magic bullet by way of processes in an organization. These things work. The difference maker is the leader. And it made me give her this answer. This process is not a magic bullet. You are the magic bullet. Effective leadership is the magic bullet. So I made this discovery that these processes only work well. Give people whatever tools are available. They could be very powerful tools and methodologies to do important work. But it's a leadership task to mobilize these things and motivate people to use them in the right kind of way. So I came to the conclusion that strategy is about leadership, and I need to collect my thoughts and write a book on leadership.
I'm so glad you did. It's really powerful. I recommend to all of our listeners that they read it. You use this term. Oh, and by the way, now I can recognize the leaders looking for the magic pill or silver bullet a mile away that really don't want to do the work. They just want the reward. And you use this term in the book, divine discontent. And we hadn't talked about this, but one of my business partners and a very good friend before he passed was Jack Welch. And I've heard you reference him before. What an amazing friend and mentor and all that for me, going through. But I think he fully had the divine discontent. There's always a better way than we can think of today. It's our job to find it, all the way through. So in your book, so many amazing nuggets for all of our listeners that they take the time to read it. The leadership, the inside story, time-tested prescriptions for those those who seek to lead. And from this conversation here today, Willie, I wish we had more time. If you could see my screen, I've got about 60 different topics to talk about that we didn't have a chance to talk about. I got so much out of the book. Was there one big takeaway from you or for you listening to this?
I think at the end of the day, thinking purposefully about how we lead ourselves got me to the point where I established a credo of sorts for myself. And you can look at me and you can see I'm not a young person anymore, but I'm still working full time, teaching at Columbia, consulting, writing. So my little credo consists of 3 things. First one is never retire. Do something useful with your life, but don't withdraw from life. Never retire. Second is keep learning. There's always new things and exciting things to learn. That's the way we grow. And that's the way we fulfill our potential. And the third is lead life at a reasonable pace. Lead some space to think, to read, to contemplate what life is all about. Never retire, keep learning, and lead life at a reasonable pace.
I am working on that third one. I feel like
That's hard.
It seems hard. And I agree. I will never retire. I'll be 63 next month. And I jokingly say I'm about a third of the way through my life. I can't wait to see what I'm going to do in the next 2/3, running at it. I can't imagine stopping. It's so good for our brains.
Absolutely. Yeah.
To stay in the game. Well, Willie, thank you so much for being here. This has been a master class for me on leadership. Thank you. And I hope sometime in the future I can have you back. I have another, 30 to 60 plus topics to talk about.
That'd be a pleasure. It's lovely to talk to you, Lee. Thank you.
My pleasure. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast. If you got value out of today's episode, please like and subscribe. And until next time, wish you all the best creating value in your world.